the USA and its allies want a lot of governments to vote their way in the UN. And for many of those other governments, the position is, yep, that's a breach of international law, not the first one we've seen. You're coming to us now and you want our votes, but where are you on other issues which we care about?
I actually do wish that countries would take a firmer stance on Russia's invasion in Ukraine because it's a clear violation of international law. And I think what is important is for countries not to see international law as separate to their realist interests.
Global Eyes, a new take on security policy by DW.
Europe has to come out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. These are the words of the Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, and these words have found a mention in the recent Munich Security Report. Hello and welcome to Global Eyes. I'm Isha Bhatia, and today we are at the Munich Security Conference. We are doing the show from Munich, and it's a bit of a different setup, a bit of a different format, and also a different host.
That's right. I'm William Glucroft. I cover security issues for DW, and a pleasure to be co-hosting Global Eyes.
And we have two esteemed guests.
That's right. To my left, we have Lynn Kuok today. She's Senior Fellow of Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So glad to have you on our episode today. And over on my far right, Dan Smith, the Director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, better known by some people as SIPRI. And we are going to have a conversation today about global security at the Munich Security Conference and what that means, in so many different parts of the world. Obviously, specifically Asia Pacific is a huge, plays a huge role here. But first, I want to direct a question to Dan, more of a global view, which is the war in Ukraine, which obviously has dominated this conference, has dominated conversations. There have been long-standing grievances, though, that long predate the war in Ukraine. But the war in Ukraine is bringing those grievances out between the West and what we're calling the global South, countries all around the world. How has the war in Ukraine kind of highlighted those issues?
I think it's highlighted them in two ways. One, in the sense of contributing to problems that were serious and developing. And have been made worse. And the other one is, in a sense, you could say, in terms of perception and relations. So on the first one, I'm primarily thinking about food, right? The number of food insecure people, extreme food insecurity, which means they don't know where their next meal is coming from, rose to 345 million people in 2022, which is an increase of about 150 million just in the year, just as a result of the war in Ukraine, the impact that has had on both on the harvest and on export of food. The sanctions play a part as well. So one side of this is to say that the war in Ukraine is horrible, the human toll is catastrophic, but there is a whole set of other casualties of the war in Ukraine that actually, to be fair, I think that many European governments and European opinion and newspapers are indeed thinking about. Then on the other side, in terms of the kind of the perception and relations, basically what we call the West, let's say the USA and its allies, want a lot of governments to vote their way in the UN, they would love more to take up sanctions and so on. And for many of those other governments, the position is, yep, that's a breach of international law, not the first one we've seen. You're coming to us now and you want our votes, but where are you on other issues which we care about? And I think that for a lot of countries and governments around the world, the truth is that Ukraine is not the biggest thing that has happened for them in 2022. The biggest things are, for hunger for sure, but climate change, inequality, recovery from COVID, the cost of living crisis, inflation, the general entrenched problems of development. And I guess, the US and its allies need to learn a little bit more about hearing that and giving some respect to it, if only because they want the support in the UN General Assembly and so on.
And that speaks to that quote that, Isha, you mentioned at the top, that Olaf Scholz himself quoted.
Exactly.
About that, Europe sees its problems as the world's problems, but the world's problems not necessarily as Europe's problems. And that
exactly.
And Olaf Scholz said he has a point.
Yeah. that he has a point. And I'm glad that you break it down like this, because before I come to Lynn, I'd just like to briefly tell you about the show that we do, Globalize. Basically, at conferences like these, you guys are talking about really complex issues, security issues, but we like to break it down so that people out there, they can understand how that really affects their lives. How does it really come down to them? And I'm really glad that you just broke it down like that. So the core question that we want to focus today is that 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine, is the West out of touch with the global South? So Lynn, I'd like to ask you, the Ukraine war seems to bring China and Russia closer. Do you think that this is going to change the world order, or how do you see it? How is it developing vis-a-vis rivalry between China and the US?
Thanks for that question, Isha. But I did want to follow up on what Dan said
sure.
earlier. It's certainly true that the war in Ukraine is impacting people on a very basic level. The food prices are going up, the energy prices are going up. And what was very telling is that at Asia's main security dialogue, and so here we are in Munich, but in Asia's main security dialogue last year, the Shangri-La dialogue, which my institute's responsible for hosting, almost all the Southeast Asian ministers talked about the implications of the war in Ukraine in reference to its implications for food and energy prices. But I think there are also other implications of Ukraine for Asia, and this goes beyond just food and energy prices. So in a way, I would argue that Europe's problems are Asia's problems, because it makes the situation, the geopolitical situation worse. And this comes to your question about, the China-Russia alignment. So I think the first way in which the war in Ukraine actually worsens the geopolitical situation in Asia is that, of course, it contributes to an already worsening rules-based order. So we saw the rule of law being undermined in the Asia-Pacific, not least by China's actions in the South China Sea already. Now with the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we see that being further undermined. And of course, when we have the erosion of the rules-based order in one part of the world, it's undermined everywhere. It's not just in one part of the world that it's affected, it's international law. So when it's affected in one part of the world, it's undermined elsewhere as well. And then the China-Russia alignment, this impacts Asia tremendously, because this is Russia's war in a sense. China, I think, made a fatal mistake, a terrible mistake in terms of issuing its joint statement, declaring that their partnership or their friendship with Russia was a no-limits partnership on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what has happened is that has allowed the West, in a sense, to go further in terms of painting Russia and China in the same camp, the camp of autocrats, the camp that is evil and that is against the West and democracy. And I think that's also not very helpful, because Russia's actions are Russia's actions, China's actions are China's actions. Let's call China out for its actions, but let's not add fuel to the fire by looking at China being an autocrat, and that. How do we find solutions after that in terms of working with China? Are we asking China to change its system of government before we can work with them? I think that the US and China and other countries have plenty of problems to work through: trade, technology, disputes over sovereignty and sovereign rights in the maritime domain. They do not need to add further fuel to the fire in terms of ideological differences as well, because those become very intractable.
Do you think there's a mismatch? Jan was bringing it up about what, we're using the terms West and Global South. I think we can spend an entire episode just debating these terms.
Right.
But for lack of better, more nuanced terms, is there a mismatch in what, the United States, its wealthy Western allies are projecting when it's talking about values? The war in Ukraine is about values, about democracy, democratic values. And as you've pointed out, Asian countries are talking about food and energy prices, very tangible interests. So when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and when it comes to this so-called rules-based order or world order as we've known it since the end of World War II, do you feel like that the two sides, and there's of course, again, that's an oversimplification, two sides, but is there a talking past each other that we're not getting at the same level, using different having different meanings for the same word, so to speak.
I think we should try to avoid using words like values unless we're going to define what values means. I think perhaps it'd be better to use more neutral words like international law. So the war in Ukraine is a clear flouting of international law. You're flouting sovereignty, the use of force, etc. So you don't need to use things like values, etc. I think it's much easier, I think, for countries to accept, or everyone accepts, including China, that this is an issue of territorial sovereignty. The US and Western allies, I think, need to use clear terminology which don't allow for different interpretation. So yes, I'll stop there at the moment.
Coming back to William, what you said, I know it's very fluid. We say global south. Now, after the World War II, the terms that have evolved, you had underdeveloped countries, developing countries, emerging countries. Now it's the global south. And the so-called global south now says, we have a few economies that have really developed, and we want to be at par with you. And so we don't want you, the West, to tell us what we have to do. 1 year after the war started, looking back at everything that has been done and said, do you think West kind of made a miscalculation, or was it just away from reality, that this expectation that everything that we say, the way we look at the war, the so-called global south is also going to look at the war in the same way?
I think that diplomats understood that there was a genuine diplomatic task to do to persuade a large number of countries, effectively what we're referring to as the global south, to agree with the proposition that this is not just a breach of international law, but one which you have to take a strong stand against and get that wording into the UN General Assembly resolution and so on. Whether politicians or political leaders or some of our opinion leaders are as clear about that, whether they actually think that, this is also obvious, of course they should. If they don't, then there must be something wrong with them, which feeds into, a history of not taking seriously concerns that come from countries. I mean, interestingly, the other term that was used, the term that was used when I went to university, was third world.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
And that was East, West, and the third world.
Yes.
And then there was a degree to which many of those third world countries defined themselves like that by calling themselves the group of non-aligned. So there was East, West, and now the group of non-aligned countries, and the group of 77, wasn't it? And then it became much more. So that this is thinking from the Cold War period. This is thinking from the era of immediate post-colonialism, right? And we still hear some of the echoes of that, I think, in the policy of the US and its allies, despite the fact that in many respects it has become more nuanced, but you can still hear those echoes coming through.
Very much. I mean, the United States is led by a Cold War president. Russia is led by a Cold War president. These are people who really only see the world through a Cold War lens. Is that dangerous?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I think going back to your question of that you were asking, about are Russia and China coming closer together? I think it is misleading and dangerously misleading to think of Russia and China as forming one pole and the USA and its allies forming another pole. I also dislike the language that says it's democracy against autocracy, because it is much more nuanced than that. And if you're going to say that, we can only work with democracies or something, then unfortunately the trend in the world in recent years has been against democracy. There are a lot of governments that we need to work with that are fully responsible, right? And with whom one can work on issues like climate change and should be working on issues like trade and energy and the economic inequalities and so on, and health and so forth. So I think that simplifying the world into two camps is intellectually misleading, but it's also dangerous, because you start to interpret Russia's actions as if they were China's, and China's actions as if they were Russia, and the motives as if they belong to each other, and they're not. Russia and China's interests are quite distinct. China has a trading relationship with the USA, Europe, and with the rest of the world that Russia just doesn't have, right? China is making things. Russia is digging them out of the ground and growing them, right? So there's a real distinction, and in terms of their place in the world economic order. And there's a distinction in the nature of their political interests. China's and Russia's interests are not perfectly aligned. It makes much more sense to think of it not as a straight line, but as a triangle, but not an equilateral triangle. Russia and China are closer to each other than they are to the US, of course. But, you know, the nuance in this case really matters.
And it's not like the United States has only ever worked with democracies to pursue its own interests.
And even if we look, if I might just jump in here, even if we look at India's position on the war in Ukraine, India is the world's largest democracy. And if it were accurate to say that, you know, if it considered that Russia's actions as to be one of, you know, a state that was attacking a democracy because it was an autocracy, then basically India's position would be, this is a threat to democracy, this is a threat to me. But India hasn't actually taken that position. So clearly that's not the perception that India has. And to Dan's point about, you know, partnerships and us needing to work, I mean, us, by us, I mean the US and the West, right? I mean, that's not me, but if we think about how there needs to be partnerships and alliances between those that adhere to a rules-based order, then really one should avoid the sort of divisive autocrats versus democracies framing. Because even if we look at, say, the US Indo-Pacific strategy, for instance, and the US has been repeatedly stating that framing for a long time now. But in the Indo-Pacific strategy, they talk about the need to work with countries like, you know, Vietnam, like Singapore, etc. Some of these are not liberal democracies. Some of these are not even illiberal democracies. Exactly. I won't say who's an autocrat, but you know, there's a clear need in this geopolitical environment to be working with a wide array of partners who adhere to the rules-based order, even though they're not liberal democracies.
You just mentioned India, and India has been saying ever since the beginning of the war that the only way out is dialogue and diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Macron mentioned that there is no scope of dialogue anymore. We can't talk to Russia. We can't talk to Putin. And I mean, that's the way I notice things. Scholz mentioned India, and he's going to India.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's yet another attempt to coax India? Because for the last 1 year, the West seemed to have been trying to get India on its side. Do you think that's yet another attempt? And if yes, do you think it would work this time?
I cannot speak to why they're going to India. I suspect they might try to get India to budge on its position. And I also cannot speak to what India will decide to do. But I suspect that India is quite firm in its position, and it's not going to be, what's the phrase, this lady's not for the moving, right? Or for the turning. So I don't think India is going to be budging. But, you know, that said, I actually do wish that countries would take a firmer stance on Russia's invasion in Ukraine, because it's a clear violation of international law. And I think what is important is for countries not to see international law as separate to their realist interests. I think international law is a means by which they secure their national interests. How countries, I think, have approached this issue is a rather short-term, narrow conception of their interests. So I'm not going to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine because I need XYZ from Russia, right? But I do think that how they should be viewing their national interests is that they need international law to protect them and protect the global order in an increasingly combative environment, because international law provides the guardrails for competition getting out of hand. So the international law is actually in the interests of countries like India, countries that have still not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So while I disagree with the framing of the war as autocrats versus democracies, I do wish that countries would be more forward-leaning in terms of clearly condemning a clear violation of international law.
I think that the problem here, and this also would allow you to reflect on the problem of the democracy versus autocracy framing, is that, yeah, I completely agree. International law is of fundamental importance, but it is not only Russia that has ever done something that violates some of the norms under international law. And I mean, this has been clear in the debate from the beginning. You remember the Kenyan permanent representative at the UN Security Council in February last year, when they were discussing what was then the idea of giving the two provinces in Ukraine independence. And his speech then, which was very eloquent, and it kind of went viral, right? Because he said, that's wrong, but the problem is that even members of this UN Security Council have previously been involved in breaches of international law. Now, I think that there is a difference where maybe some question of values that you don't like so much comes into play, because I think that you can think of some of the bending and pushing and nudging and cracking of international law as being like speeding on a motorway. Everybody drives about 15 or 20 kilometers beyond the speed limit, and things work out okay. But here we've got a guy who's driving a massive truck at that kind of speed, the wrong way down the. He hasn't just broken international law; he's thrown the rule book out the window. It's a really egregious breach. It's a breach of the national sovereignty of Ukraine in order to conquer the country. That was what he was saying beforehand. So I agree that something more. It would be great if something more were said. But I think that the West has also got to look at itself and think about what it has done in the last, let's say, just since the end of the Cold War, where it has pushed and shoved international law around when that was a convenient thing to be doing. And that's not to talk about the Trump presidency, even though one could.
No, long predates that.
Yeah. And that also needs to come into the picture. And if we're going to have this kind of global discussion with a lot of participants in, then there needs to be a lot of honest talking and a lot of self-reflection. And I don't think that the self-reflection will only be coming from the USA and its allies, but I do think it needs to come from there as well.
Yeah, I guess the size of the truck depends on how close it might be to your rear view mirror, if we're going to stick with this metaphor. We've been hearing a lot. I think that the word of the day is right now rebalancing. A lot of world leaders are talking about rebalancing the world order. Western leaders are saying we need to rebalance. We need to have a new dialogue with countries around the world. From the perspective specifically of the Asia-Pacific countries, when they hear the word rebalancing, do you think that policymakers and even publics buy that from when we hear from Emmanuel Macron or Olaf Scholz or Joe Biden, that they're serious about having a dialogue at the same level and at the same level of respect, which is something that Kamala Harris has talked about, something that Olaf Scholz has talked about?
Sorry, I don't quite understand your question. So this rebalancing that you're talking about, this is a term that the US started.
This is a term that we've been hearing a lot at Munich about the need to rebalance the world order, to give more respect and more say and more time to be hearing from these other countries, not be dictating or setting terms that they have to agree with, but there needs to be actually more dialogue and more cooperation. And I'm curious, on the other side of that, if they're hearing that and if they're buying it.
I think actually, if we're talking about Europe, let's talk about Europe since we're in Europe right now. We're talking about Europe's engagement with the Asia Pacific. I think it's been very positive over the last few years. In fact, I think from historically, Europe hasn't been regarded as a serious security actor in the Asia Pacific / Indo-Pacific, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. So it wasn't, it was seen as an economic power, etc. But then in the last few years, from about 2018 onwards, we saw countries like France, Germany, the UK, the EU as well, all issuing Indo-Pacific policy statements or documents. And I think this has, together with other actions such as European countries sending, asserting maritime rights and freedoms in the South China Sea, etc., making statements rejecting China's expansive maritime claims in the South China Sea. All these actions have actually helped garner European players a greater degree of credibility in the Asia Pacific, and that's been very much appreciated at a time when we've seen deteriorating security conditions, as well as concerns about having to choose between the US and China. So having Europe come in and offer more strategic options for the region, that's been very much appreciated. So I was just looking at a poll this morning by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, which is a institute that's based in Singapore, and they do a poll in terms of Southeast Asians' views of various issues. And one thing that struck me was if Southeast Asia was looking at partners to increase the strategic options, Europe came up top, followed by Japan. So I think Europe is actually doing quite well. The question, though, of course, is now with the war in Ukraine into their first year and going into its second year, whether or not Europe will be able to keep its eye on the ball, right? To maintain a focus on the Asia Pacific, not just in the security, but also in the economic realm. So to be able to play that ball as well while it's doing dealing with the war on the doorsteps.
Dan, coming back to the rearrangement that William just talked about, is West in a way in a denial that there is a growing multipolar world order?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, and then why would put in a lot of reservations under that that nuanced it a bit. But I think that there is a preference in everything to understand things in a simple way, and a multipolar world order is by definition not simple. In fact, probably you shouldn't use the term order at that point, and so on. So we like to narrow down the range of complexity. I mean, are you on my side or are you not on my side?
Right.
But that question goes wrong in so many different ways, and life is actually more complex than that. And it is perfectly possible to take a you mentioned Vietnam, right? Take a government like Vietnam. It is perfectly possible to be totally aligned with what the European Union thinks about climate change, various environmental issues, questions of water security, questions of health, and be totally at odds with what the European Union thinks about questions of political arrangements, political stances taken over long-lasting issues, and so on, and even about trade and so on. So one area of agreement does not presuppose another area of agreement, and one area of disagreement does not presuppose another area of disagreement. But I think there's another bit which goes with your question, which is about power and weight in the world, and about economic weight, and about political influence. And I think that as one looks around the world, it would be healthier if Western policymakers would start from, just as a kind of like an intellectual exercise, let's think of this as a post-Western world. Let's think that that is not the dominant order. Now, what is it that we want to do in partnership with these countries? What trade relations do we want to have? How do we want to assist in their economic strategies because we have more wealth than they do? What do we want to do to help mitigate the effects of climate change and help them adapt to it and so on? And think it through from that kind of starting point. Because I think if you start by thinking, oh, that's a group and they're on our side or they ought to be, you're already into a semi-dismissive tone to the thinking, unavoidably.
If I understand correctly, you're then saying that the trick here is for governments or countries or entities to voluntarily give up power.
Well, not necessarily to give up power, because that is asking an awful lot even of individuals, right? But to think of power as being distributed. I mean, the modern kind of theories about power in society, for example, it's a lot to do with networks. It's a lot to do with kind of social capital, not just economic capital. It's a lot to do with moral standing and so on, and ethics. And I think that you can think about this in the sense of, we have power, but they also have power. We have rights, but they also have rights. We are all rights holders, and we need to reflect on that. And the greater power and the greater capacities that I have up here in my rich part of the world means I also have greater responsibilities. And I'm setting out to fulfill those for rights holders generally. Maybe it's a little bit too philosophical, but it is it's like a mental trick, as you said. The trick is to get away from thinking about the world through that older Cold War Western lens.
More of getting away from a zero sum.
Exactly.
Giving up is not necessarily, or you taking is not necessarily me giving up.
That's right. Me doing well is you doing well. It's sort of the Chinese policy often refers to this as a win-win policy, and it becomes a kind of a cliche in their hands. It's a better my neighbor rather than beggar my neighbor approach. But it's something about the world's problems today need more wider, deeper cooperation than ever. The problem we face in the world is the appetite for cooperation is not, international cooperation is not high enough. And one of the ways in which we can try to encourage that appetite is through this kind of, in a sense, mutual respect. Because if we're not working together on these things, we won't be working well.
Lynn, Dan just mentioned post-Western world. In this post-Western world, can the neutral countries take up the role of mediator, India or China, for instance? In the Ukraine war, I mean.
I don't see it happening. China mentioned that it would be setting forward a peace plan, and I think that's to be welcomed. We should never be scornful of any peace plan put forward.
We also heard Lula da Silva talking about China, that China should take up the role. And we basically see the BRICS countries as the neutral countries. I mean, of course,
the BRICS countries, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. So could they really take up that role, or is it just speculative? Is it just wishful thinking?
At the end of the day, I don't think Russia's going to change its assessment of what it desires to do based on a third party. So I'm not that optimistic that China would be able to pull all the levers. I think when we think about the choices that face Russia, we in determining that Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine, we applied a very rationalist perspective, and so we think, oh, if China has certain leverage over Russia, etc., being the one of the few friends, they might be able to bring Russia to the negotiating table and conclude a settlement. Then we're kind of thinking about Russia's options in a very rationalist way, and perhaps that doesn't match how Russia thinks about the options on the table for itself and what it wants to achieve out of the situation. But I don't work on this area, so this is just my broad assessment of it. I think the point that Dan made about changing the mindset is quite an important one, that we need to be thinking about how, by moving away from a sort of who wins, who loses approach, we can reach greater cooperation. The difficulty, of course, is that is getting countries to move away from that. If we look at the document, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Trump administration that was declassified shortly before the Biden administration came into power, it talked about its goals in the Indo-Pacific as strategic primacy, right? So that's not a goal that melds well with something that talks about a post-Western world. And the Biden administration hasn't mentioned a similar goal, of course, in its official documents, and perhaps not even in its unofficial documents. But a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of the US or Washington at this moment sounds like what they are desirous of is to continue a certain degree of primacy. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but that's what we have. So I think it's going to be quite difficult to move into this mindset of a post-Western world, as desirable as perhaps it might be.
Which kind of probably connects to the Cold War terminology, West and East. Before we maybe close down this particular episode, maybe a final question to you both. Where do you see things going? As you've both mentioned, the world is highly interconnected, faces huge issues that affect everyone in the world: climate change, food security, health. I would imagine are the top three that affect everybody, and where these issues really don't care about borders, and yet we still live in a world run and ruled by nation states and looking at national interests. How do we bridge that?
Well, I think if you look at nation states, they have tremendous capacity. And you look at the response to COVID and, for example, the speed with which vaccines were produced, because this was a national priority and funds being put into it, effort being put into it. So I think the nation state, of course, remains the vehicle for addressing an awful lot of these issues. I think that sometimes the problem is that the nation state neither goes upscale enough for enough cooperation, nor does it go downscale enough for the local action, which is also needed for addressing an awful lot of these questions. But I don't think you can take that level of the state out. Now, you're asking, where do things go?
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, it's an impossible question. Okay, so how many hours do you have until you finally reach the end of the episode? But I think that the problem of the Ukraine war and the problems that has, in some senses, generated and in some senses highlighted in the world, that problem is not going to go away in any short time frame. And I'm afraid that I agree that the path towards peace is not a very clear one at the moment. So at the conference, everybody is saying Ukraine must win. yes, all right, but looking at the situation on the ground, there does not seem to be a quick route towards that. And if you look at the politics, there does not seem to be a quick route towards any kind of peaceful settlement. So one can talk about the importance of dialogue and asking for a peaceful solution, but it doesn't get traction in the real situation that Ukraine faces today. So I think that problem is going to go on. And what I think we should be looking for then is forms of multilateral cooperation that some people refer to as minilateral. Not necessarily the whole world, not everybody, every state all at the same time, but enough to get some actions done to look after, to some degree, the food insecurity problem that is especially hitting Africa, to look after the health issues that are hitting us all, and to get action both on mitigating and adapting to the impact of climate change, which means mobilizing large amounts of finance, for which you come back to the nation state again.
Lynn?
When you ask where does it all end, I think the broader geopolitical question beyond Ukraine is the US-China competition. And I think in that respect, the signs or the trajectory aren't good. The US administration has talked about them competing where they must and cooperating where they can. But if we look to identify issues where cooperation might be possible, where it's an issue that affects all countries, or at least the US and China, the COVID was a clear example of where cooperation would have been ideal and would actually have helped both countries. But that didn't happen because the broader competitive streak won at the end of the day. And now all the issues are now viewed through the lens of what it adds or detracts from your power. So, if you're looking at, climate change, at the end of the day, they're going to be looking at, okay, if we cooperate on this, is this going to benefit China more? Or is it going to benefit me more, right? And so it becomes very difficult to even cooperate on the issues where you think it's a no-brainer to cooperate on. So I think the competition is going to move ahead, and any rhetorical peacemaking, when they start talking nicely to each other, is just going to be that. It's just going to be talk, because fundamentally there's deep distrust between the two powers. The US is worried about its position in the world, as well as certain rules. China, of course, hasn't only been suspicious of the United States since the Trump administration. This is a deep-seated suspicion of the United States, the 1995-1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which China still thinks, many people in China still think was not accidental, the 2001 EP3 incident, the US throwing its hat in the ring in what China considers its neighborhood on the South China Sea in 2010. So these are all deep-seated issues that China has with the United States. The US is worried about its position. So this competition isn't going to go away. The only upside, I think, that we must work towards is putting a limit to that competition so that it doesn't break out into open kinetic war. And that in that respect, I come back to the importance of the rule of law, the rules-based order, international law. That is important. And that brings me back again to how countries, as far as possible, even when it seems insignificant to them. So some countries think that Ukraine doesn't matter to them, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine is so far away, it doesn't matter. I think this is an ample opportunity for them to actually display or demonstrate awareness of the importance of international law in securing their peace, stability, and prosperity moving forwards.
So I think it's right to say that the Ukraine war, that has been the tipping point or the turning point between the West's relationship with the global South, and the split is just widening. And the only way forward, the way I understand both Dan and Lynn have said, is cooperation. And it's not going to be a very easy way. It's going to take a lot of time before we reach peace, or we reach even a good cooperation on both the levels, right?
I would say it's a Zeitenwende, as Olaf Scholz said a year ago, just after the war, but it might be a Zeitenwende, this change, this historical turning point in ways that maybe he hasn't even imagined.
Right. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining, for tuning in. If you are watching this on YouTube, then do let us know, what do you think about it? Has the West lost touch with the global South? Thank you and goodbye.
Global Eyes, a new take on security policy by DW.